election held amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Election that was called after the opposition parties asked the Prime Minister to wait until after the crisis. An election called as Afghanistan was falling. An election called as British Columbia was burning and feeling cut off from Ottawa. The Prime Minister said he was calling a pandemic election because it was a pivotal time for our country. So pivotal, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister took his sweet time to bring the House of Commons back to be accountable to Canadians at this pivotal time. So pivotal that 3 months after, he has still not put in place the full structure of government and committees and Parliament. And the time was so pivotal for Canada that even the Prime Minister relented and brought back Parliaments months late, and then immediately began to avoid scrutiny and accountability in the same way we ended the previous Parliament, Mr. Speaker. One of the first actions of this Liberal government was to partner with the NDP to avoid accountability by returning Parliament to a virtual format. Le Premier Ministre ignores la grande responsabilité qui
ignores the great responsibility that comes with Parliament. He also ignores the real consequences of his multiple failures and his economic failures for families, elderly and small businesses everywhere in the country.
Mr. Speaker, but the Prime Minister still forgets that being Prime Minister of Canada is more than photo ops, more than announcements. This House is supposed to be a reflection of this great country, its hopes, its fears, its aspirations for the future. This House is supposed to reflect the will of the people in this great country. But this Liberal government seems intent on only governing for the connected few. And that was clear in the speech from the throne that completely ignored most of the critical issues facing Canada now, Mr. Speaker. From the inflation crisis, the cost of living crisis, economic uncertainty, and severe labor shortages, to alienation in the West, an erosion of trust in this government, and the complete collapse of Canada's reputation on the world stage. The Prime Minister remains completely disconnected from the real needs of Canadians and is causing our country to be less prosperous and more divided. Too many voices in Canada don't feel heard. So, as leader of the Conservative opposition, I'm going to share the voices of several Canadians who want to see real action from this government. Canada's Conservatives will be the voice for all Canadians being forgotten or left behind by the Liberal government. While the Liberal and NDP MPs in this chamber will go back to hiding in their basement on Zoom, Mr. Speaker, we will be here to be a voice for the voiceless, to fight for the country which has never been more divided. We will be the voice for the millions of Canadians who believe in this country and want their elected officials to address the real issues being talked about at the kitchen tables across this country. Kitchen tables like those in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I spoke with Peter Richardson, a business owner from Nova Scotia. Peter has been operating a boat charter company and a lobster roll eatery near the famous Peggy's Cove for many years. In a good year, Peter would hire 10 other people, Mr. Speaker, to help throughout the season that would tour guests from across the country and around the globe to enjoy Canada's ocean playground. But when I spoke to Peter, Mr. Speaker, he wonders why this Liberal government has repeatedly failed to listen to small business owners in the tourism sector as part of their COVID response measures. He knows that billions were spent. He knows businesses that were having record profits receiving support programs, while his business and those of other small operators were completely left behind. Peter, being a hard-working Canadian, found work and even helped transit the iconic Theodore the tugboat from Nova Scotia and Halifax Harbour to Ontario down the St. Lawrence. But he feels that Ottawa has not been listening to the voices of small operators in the tourism and travel sector, Mr. Speaker. I want Peter and people in those highly affected sectors of travel, tourism, and hospitality to know the Conservative Party of Canada will be your voice in this Parliament.
I also spoke with Germain Blain, the president of Beauce Atlas. It's a Beauce company. Germain, his family and employees built a steel structure business internationally recognized, which depends to the access of the American market to succeed. His business built great big projects in the country, like the Glacier Skywalk in the Jasper National Park, like the Logan Airport in Boston. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, Beauce Atlas is another business that the current government forgot. This same government who did not manage to fix the problems with Buy American, the unjust tariffs on steel and lack of workers. Germain said that many of the foreign workers were from the Philippines. These ones worked hard. They learned French. These workers are essential for his business, but they are threatened because of the waiting time for their work permits. In the throne speech, the Liberal government said nothing about the lack of workers. It's not a priority for the Liberal government. Mr. Speaker, I want Quebec businesses like Beauce Atlas know that Conservatives will put their voices. And that we are going to remedy the lack of workers.
Is heard in this Parliament is Clifford Martin's voice from Trochu, Alberta. I had a great conversation with Clifford. He's an example of one of the millions of seniors across this country who've worked hard to contribute to the growing of Canada and deserves a retirement and senior years in dignity. Clifford and so many like him in all parts of this country have felt completely abandoned by this government. Clifford drove a truck and had a number of jobs over a 40-year career before an injury at the age of 63 forced him to stop working. During the pandemic, he applied for support from the government. Clifford specifically asked the agent whether qualifying for the pandemic support would impact his pension or eligibility for guaranteed income supplement. He was told directly by his government that it would not. Yet without any notice, he was cut off in July and now is struggling. Shameful. He also sees thousands of other families in his province, in Alberta, struggling and losing faith not only in this government, Mr. Speaker, but in Canada. How did all of this happen, Mr. Speaker? Some of the proudest Canadians losing faith. How did vulnerable people like Clifford reach out to their government, give their social insurance number, ask specific questions? How could they be told the wrong information? How could they be failed so badly by their government? How could they design these programs to leave people like Clifford behind? This is another example, Mr. Speaker, why Parliament needed to come back, why we need committees to come back, to make sure that people aren't left behind again. Because, Mr. Speaker, time after time, this government has dropped the ball, and Parliament needs to be here to pick it up again for the Cliffords of this country.
That's right.
And Mr. Speaker, he told me, as a result of the cuts in July, his cupboards are bare at the end of the month, and he relies on food banks. Like a compassionate Canadian, Clifford also told me, quote, "I try not to make using the food bank a habit, as there are people out there worse off than me," end quote. I find inspiration in that, Mr. Speaker. That is the inspiration of our citizens, of our country, struggling and facing challenges themselves, but still thinking of others, Mr. Speaker. The generosity of Clifford and the hearts of the people in Alberta are an example to us here in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. And Clifford's not alone. I spoke to the organizer at Food Banks Canada, Mr. Speaker, who ties together their network of members, food banks in small towns, large cities, remote communities, Indigenous communities across this country. And Food Banks Canada told me Clifford's situation is not unique. Food banks across this country have seen an acute rise in use from families renting in the economy, with rents going up, raising children, and needing to access food banks to keep people fed. Single seniors living on their own, fighting against the cost of living increases that are leaving them drowning at the end of the month, Mr. Speaker. They are also a group of Canadians using food banks more. And Clifford in Trochu, Alberta, is just an example of that. So food banks across this country are trying their best to meet the rising need. But we know that inflation, the cost of living crisis this government is trying to ignore, is going to put additional strain on all of these important agencies in our community. So, Mr. Speaker, that is why inflation matters. That is why, Prime Minister, monetary policy matters.
That's right.
That is why the budget, debt, deficits, job creation, competitiveness, that is why our economic future matters. Something lost completely on a Prime Minister who's making us less prosperous and is driving up the cost of everyday living, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are falling behind, and I want to thank those generous citizens, organizations like food banks helping lift people up. I want to champion and salute food banks across this country, thanking their volunteers, their donors and employees, including Feed the Need Durham in my area, the Daily Bed Food Bank in the GTA, Mr. Speaker. And I want to use this opportunity to invite Canadians and all their communities to support their food banks at the Christmas season, Mr. Speaker. Be like Clifford. Make sure you're thinking about people in your community and step up to help your food banks this Christmas season. Mr. Speaker, these are just a few of the voices that Conservative members have been telling me about and connecting me with across this country. Families and businesses that are struggling as our country faces a cost of living crisis, a housing crisis, economic challenges, and strains on mental health and wellness. There is hardly a family in this country, Mr. Speaker, that has not been directly touched by the mental health strains of this pandemic. Canadians are feeling the pressure, and they're getting priced out of their own lives, Mr. Speaker. They worry about the debt being heaped on the shoulders of their children. They love this country, and they wonder how a Prime Minister who decides to vacation for a day dedicated to reconciliation can be the same Prime Minister who uses our national flag as a political prop. Notre pays traverse une crise grave.
Our country is going through a severe crisis. Canadians are more divided than ever. Families all have more challenges and stress. Our economy is weak and our prosperity is threatened. During this time, Canadians see a Liberal government completely disconnected from these realities. A government that is so disconnected that it makes these challenges worse.
High deficit agenda will cripple our economy at a time that it is already teetering on the edge. The Prime Minister's ideological and activist agenda will further erode our national unity, Mr. Speaker, at a time when it is already under massive pressure. Rhetoric and empty promises are what we've heard from this government at a time when Canadians desperately need progress. Ambition has trumped achievement. Symbolism has replaced action. And division has eclipsed unity after 6 years of this Liberal government. It's also clear, Mr. Speaker, that my friends in the NDP will not hold the Liberals to account. Instead, days after campaigning against them in the election, the NDP were campaigning to join them in some sort of coalition that will make our challenges even greater and will give this Liberal government a pass on accountability. Well, Mr. Speaker, Canada's Conservatives will not stay silent while our collective prosperity is put at risk. My friends in the NDP have forgotten who they used to represent, Mr. Speaker. Canada's Conservatives are the real voice for working Canadians in this country. We are the real voice of small business owners, of steel and auto workers, of farming families, of parents and seniors. And as the official opposition, we will continue to fight for an economic recovery, not just for the friends of the Prime Minister, for every Canadian in every region and every sector of this country. Because that's why we're here, Mr. Speaker. This is Canada's House of Commons, and after COVID-19, after the last almost 2 years, every Canadian family deserves a recovery and a return to as much as life as normal as possible, and not just for the select few that the Liberal government thinks are worthy. But our economic recovery post-pandemic is in jeopardy. Many businesses, investors, employers, entrepreneurs are already starting to give up on Canada. Over the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals have spent a staggering $400 billion above what the government should have been spending. And in the 4 years before that, let's not lose sight, Mr. Speaker, in good economic times, with strong employment numbers, they ran another $100 billion of debt. Wow. $500 billion of debt by this government, with an economy that is only enjoying tepid growth. Our country is drowning in the rising water of debt, and that is fueling inflation and uncertainty. Right. I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker. The pandemic was a crisis that needed a response. And whenever there was a time to put our country first, from the first wave to today, Canada's Conservatives will always put the country first, Mr. Speaker. The impact of COVID-19, particularly early on, required a swift and large series of supports to help families and to help businesses stay afloat. We needed to spend, but we didn't need to spend more than almost every other country on the planet. We didn't need to double the national debt. We didn't need to pay students living at home with their parents not to work. We didn't need to ignore, as this government did, small businesses like Peter's in Nova Scotia, in tourism, in hospitality, our restaurants. They needed the support, but they've told us repeatedly they felt abandoned. Worse than just being slow and unfocused, the Liberal government threw away money on spending that didn't foster economic growth and preserving the future. Rather than focus on investment and stimulus to kickstart our recovery and strengthen the economy, the government was focused on furthering their own partisan agenda. The Deputy Prime Minister herself said the pandemic created, quote, a window of political opportunity, end quote. Well, it certainly was an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, for the We Charity. It certainly was an opportunity for former Liberal MPs like Frank Baylis. It certainly was an opportunity for Liberal lobbyists and the thousands of documents covered up so we couldn't see how well they accessed support. Even when the government was in crisis, Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister and his inner circle gave special access to their friends and insiders, while people like Peter in the tourism sector, restaurant owners, couldn't get their calls returned. This type of special access to friends and family of the Prime Minister has been there from his first days in office, Mr. Speaker. And you wonder why there's growing cynicism about public life, about Parliament, about politicians. This Prime Minister has set a tone of corruption from day one, and it's sunk in all the benches of his government.
That's right.
Canada's Conservatives have repeatedly warned the government about reckless spending and insider deals, what it would cost our country in terms of prosperity and unity. For more than a year, we warned them about the flood of money into our system, the constant extension of programs and CERB and other benefits when there were labor shortages. We warned them that it would fuel inflation, especially if spending wasn't targeted and time limited. Now we are watching the consequences of their actions in real time, Mr. Speaker. Heating your home is more expensive. Natural gas up 20%. Filling up your car is more expensive under this Prime Minister. That's up 42%. Buying food for your family, Mr. Speaker, to put food on the table is more expensive, up 10 to 20% for nutritious foods, Mr. Speaker. All of this piled on top of housing inflation put in motion by this Prime Minister and in action for the last 5 years that is pricing Canadians out of their own neighborhoods. Rent is up 20% this year alone in some Canadian cities, Mr. Speaker, while wages are flat or declining. Everything is going up except the optimism of Canadian families for our prospects in the future. Canada is the only country in the G7 where inflation is dramatically accelerating quarter after quarter after quarter, while our GDP is flat or even shrinking in some quarters, Mr. Speaker. You will hear the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister ignore people warning about the cost of living crisis and suggest that it's transitory, it's temporary. Canadians know the prices aren't going to go down, Mr. Speaker. They see no plan to tackle the labor shortage, Mr. Speaker. They know this is not true. They know the Prime Minister doesn't understand the pressures families are facing because he's never had to face pressures in his life, Mr. Speaker. Other countries are experiencing a degree of inflation, but only Canada is seeing our economy in actual long-term decline, Mr. Speaker. The United States is facing inflation, but quarter after quarter, they've had roaring GDP growth. Under this Liberal government, Canada spent the most per capita amongst our allies on COVID benefits, Mr. Speaker, and got the worst results. Hundreds of billions of dollars spent, and we have an unemployment rate that is almost 2% above the G7 average. Inflation has skyrocketed to 4.7% and is still rising, while hourly wages are barely 2% up over a year ago. That means the average Canadian worker is experiencing a 3% pay cut at the worst possible time. Canadian families are being forced to make hard choices, Mr. Speaker. Families raising kids, seniors, especially single seniors on fixed income, are having to do more with less, and they are worried. They don't see this as being transitory or temporary. They see this hurting their lives today. While the Liberal government and some of their pundits will continue to downplay the long-term risks to our economy and the challenges facing families with inflation, the results speak for themselves. Monsieur le Président, c'est bien de créer des emplois.
Mr. Speaker, it's good to create jobs. It's always been one of my objectives, but we also need to fight the problem of lack of workers. That's not just a problem, it's a crisis that affects all of Canada, like restaurants, construction sites, farms, and factories. Everywhere, we always see the same thing on business doors. We are hiring. Every day, millions of dollars are lost. Thousands of businesses have closed their doors or have moved abroad because of problems with workers. Businesses are suffering. The Prime Minister needs to realize this. He needs to protect them. The solution is facilitate the arrival of immigrant workers, invest in specialized training programs, and recruit students, retirees to work in certain jobs, and reducing unlimited spending. When will the Prime Minister finally listen?
Canada spent the most per capita of any G7 country, only to achieve the worst economic outcomes. Our employment rate shows that, Mr. Speaker. And these just aren't numbers, Mr. Speaker. They are real people. The mother who lost her job in the tourism sector in Victoria, the student in Hamilton who relies on waiting tables to help pay for school, the energy worker in St. John's or in Fort McMurray. And now the Biden administration, with enhanced measures on Buy American and more protectionist policy and higher tariffs, threaten to cost thousands of more Canadian jobs, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister has led our country through the steepest decline in Canada-US relations in the modern age, Mr. Speaker, over the course of 3 different administrations. So we can't blame the second one, Mr. Speaker. Over 3 presidents, we have watched our partnership on trade, diplomacy, and security with the United States wither away to nothing. What was a special relationship for centuries is a token relationship under this Prime Minister. And President Biden admitted as much last week when he described relations with Canada as the, quote, easiest relations they have.
Easy for them.
A one-way street, Mr. Speaker, is quite easy. It's easy for the U.S. to dominate, easy for the U.S. to win with this Prime Minister, easy to ignore Canada under this Liberal government. So when it comes to Canada-U.S. relations, Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister's track record over 6 years could be the subject of an hour speech alone. His approach is one of symbolism, posturing, and failure to express a shared vision for our continent and for our democratic values. And over time, Canada's influence in Washington has waned to a point that Canada doesn't even warrant a phone call anymore. It was easy, Mr. Speaker, for the U.S. President to cancel Keystone XL because he knows this Prime Minister doesn't care about our energy sector. It was easy for the President to ignore the actions of the Governor of Michigan when it comes down to the shutdown of Line 5 because she is following this Prime Minister's lead. It is easy for the U.S. to double softwood lumber tariffs because this Prime Minister has failed to make the case for our lumber sector 6 years ago when the President was the Vice President, Mr. Speaker. It is easy for the U.S. to box out Canada when it fixes its supply chain crisis, when it rebalances global trade with China, because this Prime Minister has ignored U.S. warnings about Huawei and other foreign takeovers. And he showed repeatedly that Canada is no longer, under this Liberal government, a trustworthy ally, Mr. Speaker. And now, it is easy for the U.S. to ignore the integrated Canada-U.S. automotive industry that goes back to the 1960s and the Auto Pact, Mr. Speaker. It's easy for President Biden to pledge massive incentives for US-only made electric vehicles because this Prime Minister has never adequately made the case for the auto, the energy, the forestry, or any sector in Washington, Mr. Speaker. And what does the Prime Minister say in the face of these risks to auto workers in Windsor, in St. Catharines, in Oshawa, and communities across Ontario and indeed across Canada? The Prime Minister said this, Mr. Speaker. He is, quote, a little bit concerned, end quote. A little bit concerned, Mr. Speaker. Failure upon failure with our most important economic relationship. And after 6 years of failure, the best we can get out of this Prime Minister is he's a little bit concerned. Well, Canada's Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, are very concerned about our economic prosperity and our future relations with the United States.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, our relationship with the United States is in tatters and is about to get worse. And finally, our Prime Minister is only a little bit concerned. We will continue to fight to restore the influence lost under this Prime Minister's watch. With our Shadow Minister and our entire team understanding the needs of working Canadians, understanding the need of the energy sector, of the steel, of the auto, understanding the needs of farming families, fighting for our security interests and our values on the world stage, Canada's Conservatives will work hard to restore that important relationship with the United States because we can't count on this government.
Mr. Speaker, at a moment where the country is more divided than ever, the Prime Minister needs to respect provinces. He needs to evolve and change his position. He needs to work with them. He needs to work as a partner and not as a paternalist. As a Prime Minister, he should concentrate on the unity of the country rather than dividing it. For me, I have a different approach, and it's not the Ottawa knows best approach like the Prime Minister. It's the Conservative approach, an approach that's respectful, that listens, that dialogues, and has common ground. The Liberal government also needs to fix the French language issue once and for all. It is time to have a modern law on official languages with more bite and that listens to the minority-setting Francophone communities. Regardless of their beautiful words, the Liberals have done nothing since 2015. They need to stop doing little politics. The French language is not only threatened in Montreal, it's also threatened elsewhere in Quebec and in Canada. It is now a priority, and it is my priority, Mr. President. I've said so, and I'm going to repeat it. Under its leadership, the Conservative Party will defend the Quebec province, its independence and culture. But for the Prime Minister, Canada doesn't have an identity. He wants Canadians to live in shame of their past, shame of their identity, and shame of their culture. He favors accusations, division, and conflicts rather than favoring listening, exchange, and dialogue or reconciliation. For him, patriotism is a problem. Loving one's country is a problem. As for me, Mr. Speaker, I've dedicated my life to the defense of my country. I served it and I continue serving it. I am very proud of that, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I will continue fighting for Canada.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen this Prime Minister continually fail to match his ambition with achievement. Nowhere is this more true than when it comes to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. The Prime Minister who once said that this relationship was the most important for him as Prime Minister was also the same person who famously turned Indigenous protesters into punchlines. The Prime Minister who went surfing rather than standing in solidarity, Mr. Speaker. The issue of reconciliation is another issue where the Liberal government prefers symbolism as a substitute for serious action. I've spoken to many Indigenous leaders, Mr. Speaker, and they're tired of the talk. They're tired of the symbolism, and they're tired of the inaction of this Liberal government. Tired of ambition with no plan. Tired of having to wait for another study, another review, another retired Liberal politician studying something, Mr. Speaker. And they're tired of more ministers who promise action and fail to deliver. Reconciliation at its core, Mr. Speaker, means re-establishing trust between Indigenous peoples and the federal government, rebuilding respect, and it means action. It means forging partnerships with Indigenous leaders, nations, and businesses to move the relationship forward together. And above all, it requires honesty and striving to over-deliver and stop over-promising.
That's right.
A promise to eliminate long-term drinking water advisories is just empty words without a plan and a firm deadline to do so, Mr. Speaker. A promise made by this Prime Minister in 2015 to move on all calls of action in the Truth and Reconciliation Report is equally hollow without a transparent process to prioritize your actions and be held accountable for them. And the painful discovery of graves at the former residential school site in Kamloops, Mr. Speaker, made the news across the country months ago. My 10-year-old son, Jack, and I talked about it, and he said to me this: "Kids aren't supposed to die at school, Dad." These are the conversations of reconciliation. These are the difficult but important conversations all Canadian families must have. And I'm sure that many families and many communities have had these difficult conversations. And what I told Jack, Mr. Speaker, was that Canada has a plan to help those families heal. Our country has a plan to return those missing children home. Our country has a plan and a roadmap to address the sins of our past and of our present. And I know the Prime Minister deeply cares about this, Mr. Speaker, as deeply as I do. And I've said this on numerous occasions. I know all members of this House want to act on the path of reconciliation. I know that all members and their families have shared the pain of Kamloops, Cowessess, Kootenay, and so many other communities, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, in June, the Conservative opposition, Mr. Speaker, pledged our cross-party support to move swiftly on calls to action 71 to 76. Before Canada Day is what we pledged back then, Mr. Speaker, to show survivors, to show Indigenous communities, to show all Canadians that we can make progress on the path to reconciliation. We can harness our tears of sorrow into the perspiration of action, Mr. Speaker. Half a year later, half a year with our flag at half-mast, Mr. Speaker, nobody knows the status of these calls to action related to missing children at former residential school sites. Once again, no urgency, no transparency, no action from this government. There is no leadership from the Prime Minister on this issue, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that he cares and makes those promises. Canada's Conservatives want to see steady and measurable progress on reconciliation with First Nations, Mr. Speaker. We want families in urban and rural, on and off reserve settings to be lifted out of poverty. We want the next intergenerational transfer, Mr. Speaker, for Indigenous peoples to be wealth and opportunity, not more decades of trauma. And with the cost of living crisis our country is facing, this is more important than ever for First Nation communities and Indigenous families. We need to dismantle barriers that hold back too many young Indigenous people from jobs, skills development, and post-secondary education. We need to build partnerships, Indigenous supply chains, including in the energy sector, and revenue sharing models for First Nation communities and businesses across the country. First Nation leaders are there, businesses are there, but this government isn't. And we must take action on housing and focus on mental health and addiction support, Mr. Speaker. Je tiens à féliciter le gouvernement libéral.
I want to congratulate the Liberal government for having created the Minister for Mental Health. I like believing that our politics and activities have helped, but once again, I hope that it's not just symbolic, as usual, Mr. Speaker. Like me, Canadians want concrete measures.
For significant funding for culturally appropriate services to end addiction and the mental health epidemic on and off reserve for Indigenous Canadians. I want inequality and discrimination to become things of the past and for Indigenous peoples to be full partners in the prosperity of Canada. And when the Liberal government takes ideological action that hurts the prosperity of Canada, actions against the resource sector, whether capping or trying to stop resource development, Canadians need to know they're also hurting progress on the road to reconciliation. This government, countless times, has violated their constitutional duty to consult First Nations, and they're holding back partnerships and opportunities for Indigenous peoples to have prosperity, Mr. Speaker. Ideological policies are leaving behind millions of Canadians and causing strains to our national unity. The world is currently facing an energy crisis, Mr. Speaker. We see it ourselves in our everyday lives when we go to the pumps and gas is almost 50% higher. We see it in President Biden calling for OPEC and other energy producers to increase production of oil and gas to lower soaring energy prices that could complicate global pandemic recovery. Nothing shows how out of touch and how ideological unsound this government's natural resources policy is better than what is happening right now in Washington. Our closest ally, the United States, Mr. Speaker, is asking for more oil and gas from countries in OPEC while they're holding back the Canadian energy sector with the cancellation of Keystone XL and the threats to Line 5, Mr. Speaker. And what is the Prime Minister going to do about this? Is he a little concerned about this too, Mr. Speaker? Once again, under this Prime Minister, it is easy for the United States to ask for less from Canada while asking for more from countries like Angola, Libya, and Venezuela. Canada has some of the most ethical and most environmentally conscious, the most regulated and highly transparent energy production in the world, Mr. Speaker. We are leaders in terms of environmental and social governance, ESG, Mr. Speaker, and we're the top leader in the world when it comes to ESG and Indigenous participation, Mr. Speaker. Canada is the energy ESGI power in the world, Mr. Speaker, and we should be leveraging that to help Canadian families, to help our country, and to help with reconciliation. Canada, as the leader of democratic resource countries, could step up and increase production to address the energy crisis. We can fill the void, Mr. Speaker, helping Canadian families and helping our trade partners. The world can trust our industry's commitments to net zero, to GHG emission while they can't trust a word that comes out of any of the OPEC countries, Mr. Speaker. We have labor organizations, union leaders, union members right across this country who've helped get their hands dirty making our energy and natural resource sector world leaders, while being a source for hundreds of thousands of stable, well-paying jobs for their members. Unlike the NDP and unlike the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party will stand alongside those working families for their future, Mr. Speaker. Yet this Prime Minister and his new Environment Minister, who I think is cycling to Ottawa as we speak, they want to deny the energy sector the opportunity to supply the world to fill this gap with ethical, lower-emission Canadian energy at a time that it's desperately needed. This government would rather ship crude up the St. Lawrence from Saudi Arabia or Venezuela than ensure a worker in Edmonton or in an Indigenous community can provide for their family, and that is a failure, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
The Prime Minister likes to pretend that we cannot support our energy sector while maintaining our commitment to climate action and lowering emissions. His recent cabinet choices seem to reward activists and demote pragmatists, Mr. Speaker. The astronaut gets grounded and the activist gets launched, Mr. Speaker. Time in handcuff for stunts is valued over time and space for our country, Mr. Speaker, and there's something wrong with that. Or you could say, Houston, we have a problem, Mr. Speaker. Once again, on the world stage, this is another example of this Prime Minister with his ambition and symbolism rather than achievement and concrete action, Mr. Speaker. Despite the tweets and taglines, this Prime Minister has never hit one of his emission reduction targets. Talk's a great game, Mr. Speaker, like everything. Budgets will balance themselves, emissions will lower themselves, Mr. Speaker. He has failed on every single piece of his legislative agenda in 2015, except marijuana, Mr. Speaker. I guess that's a personal favorite for him. He has failed on every measure, Mr. Speaker. He's raised our taxes, didn't lower our emissions. We're the only country in the G7 where emissions have gone up over his time in government over the last 5 years. And now, the Prime Minister is tripling down on his failed policy by tripling the price of his carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Conservatives know, and we showed this in conversations, in discussions, in actual tangible plans, that we can protect our environment, we can lower our emission, we can meet our international amendments and agreements without sacrificing our economy, without giving up on Clifford and Trochu, Alberta, Mr. Speaker, without giving up on families in Newfoundland and Labrador, as the Liberal MPs have for 6 years, Mr. Speaker. We know it is possible to work with our energy sector to lower emissions while providing jobs and opportunity at home, while supplying sustainable and ethical resource products to developing countries and to our democratic allies that should want to source their energy from a country like Canada to transition to a lower carbon future. They want their coffee to be fair trade. They should want their energy to be fair trade as well, Mr. Speaker. We can lower emissions. We can promote green technologies, generate electricity emission-free through nuclear, through hydro, through carbon capture and sequestration, all while protecting jobs in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, in fact, in all parts of this country, Mr. Speaker. Les investissements dans l'énergie propre, comme l'hydrogène et les petits réacteurs modulaires,
modular reactors can help us reduce emissions in Canada and throughout the whole world, but Canadians see the opposite. They see the Liberal government laying down in front of militant groups instead of making the real job to promote innovation and create jobs in the country.
This government to get serious about Canada's economic and environmental future, because their record has been dismal on both, Mr. Speaker. They're failing on both measures and dividing the country as they go. And speaking of dividing the country, the pandemic election was focused at that, Mr. Speaker. We saw that. No hiding it. There was no reason for the election. In fact, everyone asked him not to. The Prime Minister planned on dividing East versus West, vaccinated against non-vaccinated, adding to the pressure when we should have been reducing it to tackle hesitancy. Right. We know the COVID-19 pandemic has been an extremely difficult time for our country. That's why it required us not to play to those difficulties and divisions, Mr. Speaker. And it's been shameful to see the Prime Minister fall short of that. And his whip lately, Mr. Speaker. These hard times have often brought out the best in people outside of Parliament, especially our frontline healthcare workers, to whom we all owe a great debt, Mr. Speaker. We should also give a big thanks to hundreds of thousands essential workers, truckers, and the people that stepped up to work, particularly where times were uncertain. They stepped up to help for their friends and their neighbours in need. But when our country needed to be unified, the Prime Minister used vaccines as a wedge issue, both before and during the election. And research shows, Mr. Speaker, the best way to increase vaccination rates is to incentivize, educate, and persuade, instead of doing the tough work to combat hesitancy, to combat misinformation, to encourage vaccination. The Prime Minister added to the confusion and to the division in the country at a time when he should have been taking the pressure down, Mr. Speaker. He needed to partner with the provinces delivering the health care, Mr. Speaker, not use them as punching bags. Questions of health are deeply personal, Mr. Speaker. They are critical to the well-being of each Canadian, to their family, and to their community. Such questions of personal health and well-being should never be used to divide or scare Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
That's right.
When someone, including anyone watching this speech right now, has a question about vaccines, go to your physician, go to someone you trust, and have that question answered, because you need to get vaccinated. The division has also added to the isolation and the mental health costs this country is facing. And it's sad to hear the Liberals laughing as I move into mental health, Mr. Speaker. They should be listening. This is an area that should be beyond politics, Mr. Speaker, because all families have seen the impact of mental health and wellness in this pandemic. From our children to our grandparents, the loneliness and change in the pandemic has taken a toll on the mental well-being of everyone. We've seen this in higher depression rates in young people, eating disorders, out of control, Mr. Speaker. We need to have important conversations, take the temperature down to make sure people get the help they need. And there is help out there for you, and Conservatives will continue to make sure we try and bring people together on this subject. There isn't a family I've spoken to in the last year, including my own, that hasn't been impacted by this crisis. Our country has been gripped by those who we've lost to COVID, but also those who we fear we might lose due to COVID. In last year alone, Mr. Speaker, in British Columbia, there were 60% more deaths attributable to the opioid crisis than to COVID, Mr. Speaker. The pandemic became worse for opioid addictions, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, the Globe and Mail had a weekend cover page with the faces of some of the Canadians lost to the opioid crisis in the last 2 years. It moved our family so much that Rebecca and I laid the faces out on a table and had a chat with Molly and Jack about the dangers of the opioid crisis. Heartbreaking photos, Mr. Speaker, of young lives cut short, sometimes with a drug that killed them on the first attempt. Canadians like 16-year-old Elliot Urchuk from Victoria, who died 2 years ago, or 12-year-old Ali Londono from the same community, who died in April. 12, Mr. Speaker. We owe it to these families to work together on all sides of this chamber to help communities, to help First Nations, to help this country fight the opioid crisis, and we will stand in this House to do that, Mr. Speaker. We must provide options for treatment. We must work with communities who are seeing mental health and addiction change the face of their downtowns. I was talking to folks in Victoria about that weeks ago. Vulnerable Canadians, Mr. Speaker, people suffering, most with mental health conditions, are hiding in plain sight in our cities, Mr. Speaker, because we are becoming accustomed to tent cities. We're becoming numb to the misery in our path. We are getting used to just crossing the street to avoid confronting it. Mr. Speaker, let's ensure Canada does not become a country that crosses the street. We must create solutions so that those battling depression and addiction know where to turn for help. We need to ensure that wait times aren't barriers to accessing real treatment. And treatment needs to be an option, Mr. Speaker, on top of harm reduction. We also need to make sure that every voice knows that we want to hear from them. That's why the Conservatives put forward a national 988 suicide hotline in the last Parliament. It's why we've pushed for major investment in treatment beds and why we're going to push the government to finally deliver on the 988 hotline to help Canadians. I hope this is an area, Mr. Speaker, where I can finally say that ambition is matched by achievement. Let's work together to help the vulnerable in our society. Yeah. I will praise when praise is due. But once again, despite the fact that I know my colleagues on the other side are as heartbroken as any parent when they see the images of those young people from Victoria or for any community, they feel that sorrow, they want to act. So I'm now speaking to the backbench of the Liberal government. After 6 years of not being heard, tell your Prime Minister to act on mental health and addiction. Mr. Speaker, across this country, there's challenges, but there's also incredible opportunities. Canada is blessed with our resources and our people, and let's never lose sight of that. We have to fight to see wages go higher. We have to combat inflation and know that people are suffering. But there is hope on the horizon. And Parliament is about instilling hope by action, Mr. Speaker, not by words. Young people, I meet them all the time in the Greater Toronto Area or in the Lower Mainland of BC. There's a generation of Canadians in college or starting in the workforce giving up on the idea of home ownership. They don't even think it's an option. We need to see action on that. Commuters can hardly afford to fill up their tanks, Mr. Speaker. Seniors are trying to stretch every dollar as inflation ravages their fixed income. Small businesses are being squeezed by inflation, high tax, and the supply chain shortage, making their margins disappear. And as we approach the holidays, far too many families will be accessing those food banks, as I spoke about earlier, Mr. Speaker, and are worried about leaving gifts under the tree for their kids. Each month presents new challenges, and that's why each month we should be in Parliament fighting for Canadians as we face those challenges together. This Liberal government's spending is fueling inflation. The government's ideology is fueling division. And the government's platitudes are too often a barrier to real action. The Conservative opposition is here to fight for Canadians. And I've spoken about a few of them here in my speech today. We're proud of our country, and we're here to stand up for it. And we're here to fight for a plan for its prosperity and for its unity. And we're going to be relentlessly focused, Mr. Speaker, on an economic recovery after this pandemic. I've said it once and I will say it again, a recovery in every sector of our economy and in every region of this great country. Hear, hear. On inflation, on the budget, on taxes, on support for workers, on reconciliation, on climate change, on mental health, on the future. I want Canadians to know you have a voice in Ottawa with the Conservative opposition. We will actually be here, Mr. Speaker, and we will be a strong voice. And I want Canadians to know that they will have a choice to make in the future. Achievement over empty words and ambition. More of the same from the Liberal and NDP coalition in its official or unofficial form, Mr. Speaker. More of the same lofty rhetoric, more of the ideological division gripping our country, more of the ethical scandals and cover-ups that are becoming the hallmark of this Prime Minister's government, or Canada's Conservative opposition, who will stand up for all Canadians, who want to stand up for those who work hard to provide for their families. In all parts of this great country, we will be your voice. The voice of Canadians who want to see a clean environment and a lower carbon future, but who want to leverage Canadian energy and innovation as part of that future, Mr. Speaker. The voice for Canadians who are proud of what we build and what we invent here in Canada, from the critical minerals in electric vehicles to the steel, aluminum, and the people that go into making them, Mr. Speaker. The voice of Canadians who are proud of their country and want to see real progress on the path of reconciliation and not just symbolic gestures. Les Québécois ont assez d'attendre et de
Quebecers have enough of just getting the crumbs from the Liberal government. They want to be respected by Ottawa. They want a federal government that's efficient, that's going to fight the workforce shortage, that's going to fight the inflation, all the while preserving their identity and autonomy. Only the Conservatives will do that. Only the Conservative team will deliver and defend the interest of Quebecers. Of Quebec.
I want Canadians to know that we heard you in the election. You did not want the pandemic election, and you sent back another minority parliament to get to work. You may have kicked the tires on the Conservative Party or even on me, but you didn't buy the car. I want you to know we're going to never stop fighting to earn your trust, and we want you to buy the blue car next time.
Yeah, yeah.
I am proud, Mr. Speaker, to lead a passionate, experienced, and capable team of women and men from all parts of this country who are here in Parliament because they love their country and they're committed to its unity and its prosperity. That's right. All of us, we will dedicate ourselves to peace, order, and good government, and to healing the divisions in this country. When we can work with the other parties in the House to make Canada more prosperous and more united, we will, Mr. Speaker. We will also be tenacious in our efforts to hold this government to account, to demand accountability, and to demand transparency. We will propose solutions to get Canada moving again, and that is what our country needs. As opposition, we will oppose, and that is our job. But we will also propose plans for the future, and that is our passion. We will fight tirelessly for Canadians at home to build strong relations and to restore our reputation abroad. We will work with Indigenous leaders, union leaders, businesses, and volunteers to create opportunities for our children and grandchildren. Conservatives will be the real voice for working Canadians, for families, and for seniors in Ottawa, because the Liberals and the NDP are leaving millions of voices behind. That's right. We will stand against discrimination, because in our country, which is as great as Canada, we must fight to make it better. And there is no room for racism, intolerance, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or extremism of any kind. Right. No Canadians should face barriers because of their faith, gender, sexual orientation, or the color of your skin. I want you to know Canada's Conservatives will fight for all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, as I slowly wrap up, and my caucus is very happy about that, I'm sure. More. I'm going to go until I hear the Liberals yelling for more now. Mr. Speaker, my true patriot love is as strong today as it was in 1991 when I first put on the uniform of service when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister of this country. Standing in this chamber and having been part of the government of Stephen Harper, giving us balanced budgets and a place in the world, serving in uniform and in Parliament, at risk on seeking helicopters and at risk on Twitter, Mr. Speaker. It is the honor of my life. I have the honor to lead the party that founded this great country, and I'm proud to have a team that is here to save it. Standing in this chamber is an honor for me to represent the people in Durham as well. And it's an honor for me to be here as the husband of Rebecca and the father to Molly and Jack. And I often talk to them about our country's challenges and its opportunities. As we emerge from the pandemic, and as families across this country talk about those challenges and opportunities, they need to see the 44th Parliament seized with those challenges and passionate about the future of this country. They don't want more words and ambition. They want concrete action and achievement, Mr. Speaker. My belief in Canada is unlimited. My confidence in its people is unbounded, and my dedication to its service is beyond measure, Mr. Speaker.
I believe in Canada. I believe in my country. My confidence in its people has no limit, and my devotion towards my country is without measure. The Conservative opposition is there to serve Canada. It is our job, Mr. Speaker, and we are going to do it.
Place the interests of the country, its unity and its prosperity at the forefront of everything we do in this Parliament, Mr. Speaker. Right. We will serve as a reflection of the country, its people, its hopes, its fears, and its aspirations. And over the course of this Parliament, we will work hard to prove ourselves worthy of what Prime Minister Borden once described as the great responsibility that comes to us as heirs of the past and trustees of the future, Mr. Speaker. And in that spirit, for those reasons, I moved, seconded by the House Leader of the Conservative Opposition, that the motion before this House be amended by adding the following. A cost of living crisis that is cutting the average Canadian worker's paycheck by 2.7%, which requires urgent action by the government to table a plan to control spending and apply a laser focus on policies that will create growth. 2, maintain the Bank of Canada's 2% inflation target. 3, increase production of Canadian energy to boost supply and lower gas prices. 4, take action to improve the resilience of Canadian supply chains. B, a stagnant economy, with Canada's real GDP growth being flat compared to others in the G7, which requires urgent action by the government to reduce the burden of taxes and regulation to restore Canada as an attractive place to invest and build a business. 2, table a plan to create growth in all sectors of the economy and boost real wages. 3, drive innovation and technology by overhauling Canada's R&D programs. C, a housing crisis that has driven home prices up 30% over the last year and priced thousands of young Canadians out of the market, which requires policies that will build an additional 1 million homes over the next 3 years by 1. Reallocating 15% of the government's real estate portfolio for housing. 2. Tackling regulatory barriers that raise costs of construction. 3. Linking infrastructure dollars to higher density zoning. 4. Committing to not tax principal residents, Mr. Speaker. D. Une grave pénurie de main-d'œuvre qui touche 60%
a great labor shortage that affects 60% of businesses in Canada and 82% of manufacturers, Canadian manufacturers, requiring the government to first improve the adaptation of criteria for immigration for employers, to simplify the rules for the foreign temporary workers rules, and third, improve the acquisition of competencies and give more power to provinces.
A national unity crisis, which requires 1. Respecting provincial jurisdiction. 2. Supporting and growing all parts of the economy, including the energy sector. 3. Restoring confidence in our national institutions, starting by returning ethics and accountability to the government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Merci beaucoup. Bravo!